Hello and welcome to Space News. Today we talk about space money. Kind of. Lack of space money. Right here. Where are we? Window of vulnerability in satellite defense due to a lack of funding to the US space infrastructure. We have MSR problems, illustrative of challenges for NASA flagship, MSR being the Mars Sample Return Program. And it talks about how Congress is starting to cut funding, leading to things such as the Jet Propulsion Lab laying off 8% of its workforce in early February. And Astra will imminently go bankrupt should it not be taken private by its two current owners. Very interesting. So we will get into those articles and one more. The satellite conjunction scare marks an inflection point in collision risk. So a Russian and an American satellite on the collision path. This, so much more. Space News, Day 31. My name's Mike. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get started. Astra warns of imminent bankruptcy. Falcon Heavy launch delay. This is a Rocket Report issue number... Where are we? 6.33 by Eric Berger. So India is building a second spaceport. Very cool. I have no idea where their first spaceport is. It will be, they do mention that it will be in Tamil Nadu, with which it aims to help private players launch small rockets. Okay, India has a fantastic space program, so be on the lookout for that. The spaceport that will be built will be dedicated to launching smaller launch vehicles and will be ready in about 2 years. Spread over 2,350 acres. How many meters squared is that? 2 kilometers squared. It's about 10 square kilometers. Not going to try and say that. Spaceport will help save propellant for small rocket launches, as the port can launch rockets directly south over the Indian Ocean without requiring crossing land masses. Definitely a good thing for a country with the most people in the world. Also, congratulations on that, by the way, on passing China. This is unlike the existing launch site at the Satish Dhawan Space Center, which adds more fuel requirements for launching into polar orbit, as rockets need to follow a curved path to the south to avoid Sri Lanka's landmass. Yeah, polar orbits are very important. You use them they're used a lot for Earth observation satellites, because as the Earth spins this way and your satellite goes this way, it's able to cover the entirety of the Earth. Second, Astra's founders warn of imminent bankruptcy. So the founders of satellite propulsion and launch vehicle company Astra have sharply cut their offer. This is the offer from the company's board of directors, from Chris Hemp and Adam London, who are the chief executive and chief technology officers, respectively. They slashed their old offer by 2/3, going from $1.5 per share to $0.5 per share, citing higher non-operating expenses, as the company used multiple third-party advisors to assess options, as well as continued cash burn. Well, it's interesting. Astra, I believe, went public via SPAC. Let's try that. Astra completes SPAC merger. So this was back in 2021. Lots of these SPACs have gone like this and then like this. So getting all of that public money and then backing out and kind of rebuying the company for pennies on the dollar. Interesting move. But if they are going to go under, what else can you do? All right, we're going to move on to MSR problems, illustrative of challenges for NASA flagship missions. We're talking about Mars missions here. Here are a couple of robots. So we have the Mars lunar rover. I keep forgetting the name of this specific beast. And then it looks like they have a couple other craft. I'm not too familiar with what else we currently have floating around Mars, whether it be American or not. If you do, leave it in the comments down below. And while we're on the topic, hit that like button, subscribe, ring the bell so you don't miss an episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Let's get back to it. So NASA's Office of Inspector General published an audit of the MSR program February 28th, i.e. a couple of days ago, that concluded the spiraling cost estimates that can be linked to a lack of stable design for the key elements of the effort and initial over-optimism in its development. Not surprising, you think of a construction project, you're trying to build a bridge, a lot of contractors come in and they say, we can totally do that for $100 million and in 3 years, and then they come back to you and it's $200 million and it's been 5, 6, 7 years. Same principle will apply to space missions. You think that you have the design down pat, and then your mechanical team comes back to you and says, listen, this truss design is just absolute garbage. What was that? We just talking about the Dreamliner. They wrapped 1.3 kilometers worth of flammable tape over the wire harnesses that they had to completely redo, wrap non-flammable tape on top of. So things like this cause extreme cost overruns in the long term, and it's very frequent in the industry. So the report did not specify or identify any major new issues with MSR beyond the assessment of an independent review board in September 23, which concluded the program's cost and schedule estimates were unrealistic and the total cost of the effort would likely be in the range of $8 billion to $11 billion for this Mars sample return mission. So MSR, not an expert, haven't looked into it too much, but my understanding is that they collect samples from Mars and then they have a series of vehicles that allow you to bring it back onto Earth. So the cost growth was of particular concern to the board, and the $7.4 billion estimate is premature and may be insufficient. Particular focus of that report was one element of MSR, which is the capture, containment, and return system. So CCRS is only a part of MSR. That was what I was describing with the capture and then send it and have a couple of vehicles bring it back to Earth. So the system being developed by NASA will be installed on the Earth Return Orbiter, which is an ESA craft, or European Space Agency. The CCRS will capture the sample container placed into Mars orbit, sterilize it, and seal it in a capsule for return to Earth. Interesting. So the CCRS is the vehicle that does all of this and then actually brings it to Earth as well, or does it pass it off? Does it do a little football handoff to another vehicle? The CCRS did not complete its preliminary design review until December 23. For those of you interested, when you're designing, this is a U.S. military design schedule, but you start with something like a mission design review or mission review, and then your next step will move on to a preliminary design review where your engineering teams have actually gone through and done the design that meets the mission requirements, but the design does not need to be super well fleshed out. And then you're going to move on to the next stage, which is a critical design review, CDR. So you'll get really into the nitty gritty. Does this make sense? Do the numbers match the reality of the situation of the engineering design? And then there are more steps on top of that. If you want to look this up, I think Wikipedia US design review, there it is. So have a look here. We have mission concept review, SRR, MDR, SDR, lots of steps. Your company probably doesn't have to do all of these, but these are the steps that I believe at least NASA follows, as well as like US Department of Defense. Anything else that I want to talk about? Okay, so I skipped a bunch of information, but here they talk about how the House bill, because of significant differences between a House bill that would fully fund the Mars sample return at nearly $1 billion in 24, and a Senate bill that would provide only $300 million, NASA directed the MSR program to slow work down in the event that it does not receive that extra $650 million. This included pausing work on the CCRS after its preliminary design review, which led to the JPL layoff of 8% of its workforce in early February. Very unfortunate. And this leads us very nicely into our next article, which is, will Congress fund space defense at least? This MSR program, much less defense focused, much more about science. But when you throw the word defense into the mix, usually the US is more willing to open their wallet. So let's have a look at that. In testimony before the Senate Armed Service Committee, this general warned that the U.S. faces a window of vulnerability over the next few years to defend critical space assets from potential aggression. The PRC's and Russians' actions have transformed space into a contested warfighting domain. So the Russians launched an anti-satellite weapon recently, which there was a kind of big hoopla in the Western hemisphere, because it created extra debris, which makes it more dangerous for things like the ISS astronauts. I'm surprised that the US hasn't tested its own anti-satellite weapons, to be honest, or if they have, did we just not hear about it? Because why would you not want one? Maybe they have other ways of disabling and disarming satellites in space. They could have tugboats that just hop, they have a tugsat that comes over to an adversary satellite and dismantles it live, or just grabs it and floats into an orbit, that making the satellite pretty much useless. So it is tasked monitoring, so Space Command, which is tasked monitoring space activity and threats, supporting US and allied military units with space capabilities like comms and surveillance, and responding to crisis involving the space domain. So China has a growing number of surveillance satellites. The PRC has deployed a fleet of 359 intelligence satellites. That's not a small number, more than tripling its on-orbit collection presence since 2018. Congratulations to China for having the launch capabilities to get these satellites into space and the technical prowess to develop these satellites. Everything's about science, everything's about learning and technology. So from a technological point of view, congratulations on your launch abilities and your space prowess. China has dramatically increased their ability to monitor, track, and target US and allied forces both terrestrially and on orbit. And Russia also continues to develop, test, and demonstrate their counter space capabilities. I'm going through an article that talks about Space Force and the military. Of course, it's going to dive into some of these military topics that I personally don't want to cover. So let's have a look at their wish list. That's more interesting. Space Command last year reached full operational capability. Whitting cautioned that does not equate to superior space defense capabilities. Reaching FOC means the command has structure and processes in place to operate, but does not mean it has sufficient capability across the board to match the pace at which other countries are advancing their space weapons programs. If you have a bunch of satellites that are able to monitor X or Y, great. But if you want satellites that actually launch or have offensive capabilities or defensive capabilities, you're going to need to spend the money to develop and design and launch those as well. I'm not sure. Honestly, all of these kinds of satellites are going to be top secret. There's not going to be a lot of information about them. Do you think that any of these countries have like a laser in space? Kind of like, it was that Bond movie where they're scanning a laser across the ground while Bond is running in front of it, trying to dodge his imminent death. If you think so, let me know in the comments. Or even if you don't think so, tell me I'm crazy. Absent commitment to a long-term investment in these integrated requirements, we risk ceding advantage to our principal strategic competitors in the space domain. Our forces today are optimized for a benign space environment. This tells me that there's mostly observation satellites, not a lot of defensive satellites that are able to avoid missiles that are trying to come and kill your sat or kill other satellites in the region. Our satellites float around, take pictures, maybe capture some signals, signals intelligence, but no ability to defend themselves as is. All right, 15 minutes. Let's move on to the last article, which talks about collision risk. The risk of collision is quite an interesting phenomenon. If you have satellites in space, you will actually be receiving collision updates from the US government telling you your satellite is at risk of collision with this other satellite. This is the percentage chance of that collision. This is the time. It's up to you to start to perform collision avoidance maneuvers. Those collision avoidance maneuvers could be anything from using your onboard propulsion to get yourself out of the way, to turning your satellite to increase drag ever so slightly, to change your trajectory such that you decrease the probability of collision. If you even bother with these collision avoidance maneuvers, I'm sure there is a threshold where you really start to consider it as a risk. I'm not sure what that is. Here's a picture of the evolution of space object spatial density from 2005, just prior to the Chinese ASAT, which is the anti-satellite test to 2021. Here's 2005. We can see the density, all green with a red band in this, let's say 10-degree off, like North Pole and South Pole, technically. The red band there, and that continues to only get more and more busy as time goes on. There was an iridium cosmos collision in 2009, it looks like, and that's interesting. I don't quite understand these patterns, so because the satellite isn't orbiting if it's kind of ripping around in this direction, so I'm not quite sure how there's this ring at the top. And then we get to 2010. The general coverage is absolutely mind-boggling. The entire Earth is just constantly, there are satellites that fly over every single point on Earth. A 2-ton defunct spy satellite and decades-old NASA spacecraft studying the upper atmosphere came within 20 meters of each other this week, sounding alarms at the Pentagon and NASA. 20 meters, that's very close. Neither satellites can maneuver, and their large mass and proximity to the ISS meant the government was closely watching the pass-by. A person familiar with the situation tells Payload a collision would have forced astronauts on board to seek shelter in the Dragon and Soyuz vehicles, as they did following a 2021 Russian anti-satellite weapons or ASAT test that generated significant debris. This is the 6th time in the last 2 years that 2 non-maneuverable space objects have come so close. The company's model suggests that a collision could have increased debris in LEO by 50%. It talks about debris in LEO by 50%. So this is the total number of objects per million kilometers. I'm not sure you'd consider this debris. Hard to draw a conclusion. The scientists at ComSpock argued that the orbital collision risk is poised to grow exponentially. In 2005, there were fewer than 1,000 satellite approaches closer than 3 kilometers. By 2022, there were more than 5,000. It is unlikely that 2 satellites that large would be built without maneuvering capabilities today, but the existence of dead satellites and large rocket bodies in orbit is a motivating factor for companies building active debris removal systems, like one Astra Scale is currently testing. Most satellites are built with maneuvering capabilities today, but issues like a satellite launched recently that was only able to get itself into the 400 or 200 kilometer altitude from Earth. It was able to reduce the amount of time it was going to spend, dead in orbit by 8 to 10 years. Even with satellite maneuvering capabilities, sometimes these programs don't plan ahead, or they run into issues and they lose delta V, so their ability to actually change their orbit, and then they're stuck up in space. And the FCC requires satellites to deorbit within 5 years of losing functionality. The ESA wants to push for active removal requirements by 2020. The Space Safety Coalition, a group of satellite operators, calls for spacecraft flying higher than 400 kilometers to be capable of collision avoidance maneuvers. Lots of satellites in that low Earth orbit band. These issues will only become more pressing as new NGSO constellations are launched from the US and China. Ultraj reported that already recent incursions by Chinese state spacecraft into Starlink's radial shell. This is a bit of a Western point of view here. You're saying that this radius from Earth is Starlink's. Space doesn't belong to anyone, but the point is taken. Increase the density and then increase the possible risk of collisions. Would be unmanageable were it not for the automation and frequent avoidance maneuvers to mitigate the high collision risk. Let's call it there. Thank you so much for sticking around. My name's Mike. You've watched Space News Day 31. I hope you have a fantastic day, and we will catch up on Monday. Ciao for now.